Please join me in welcoming Craig Towler and Angela Montgomery. Craig is the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy Center at the Center for People with Disabilities. He sits on the Board of Directors for Disability Law Colorado and is a trauma survivor. Angela Montgomery is a certified prosthetist orthotist with a prosthetic and orthotic group in Boulder. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
911, is anyone injured?
Yes, someone is injured.
2503 MR6, respond. Being described as a vehicle bumped into another vehicle that had a person on a tailgate. 911, tell me exactly what's going on.
Somebody's leg just got smashed in between two cars, and it looks very, very terrible. What do we do? What can we do in the meantime?
I'm going to give you some instructions. Hold on 1 second for me, okay? Are you there with him? 2503.
Yeah, you get a call for a full trauma alert.
Copy. 2503 MR6, the advice we're now getting possibly both legs amputated.
Copy.
My morning routine before the accident was pretty similar to what it was now. I'd wake up and I'd like to get a little workout in, or if it was nice out, I'd go right up to the Flatirons and go for a hike or a nice little jog on the trail. Always active, busy, and, having a lot of fun.
I remember coming home that day, talking to my wife and saying, I just met the most incredible person. He was unlike anyone else I've ever worked with.
10 seconds on, 10 seconds off, okay? So not much time, but speed, 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 speed. 2, 1, go!
Craig doesn't exercise, he trains. Training is different. And I think Craig is training not only his body, but his mind every day.
My friend Andrew was visiting me in the hospital, and he said that Paul was asking about me, and, it hit him really hard when he heard the news about me, and that he said that anytime I wanted to train, that I was welcome to train with him.
In the back of your mind, you're thinking, nothing changes. Everything's the same, you treat everyone the same, you don't, same attitude, same kind of workouts, same mentality, training, but it's hard, man.
So when I was still in the rehab hospital, I wanted to go to the gym. So I remember asking for, I don't think it was called the day pass, but pretty much a day pass where we used my time with my occupational therapist to go over to Paul's gym and meet with him and go through a training session.
It was tough. We spent a lot of, kind of just searching around and kind of, let's try this, let's try this. Every exercise had an asterisk next to it.
It felt familiar, and it was just an awesome setting to be in there.
Try to pull a little bit here. It's still a little bit soft.
Are we good?
Yeah.
It was probably a couple weeks, maybe 2-3 weeks after my initial surgeries and amputations. And one day, Angela popped up into my room and she said, hey, I'm a prosthetist. And she also said, be careful how you say that name. It's prosthetist.
The hospital asked me to come in and talk to both he and his mom about prosthetics. Oftentimes they do that to try to help give some people some hope of what's next.
She's an artist, and she pretty much is the reason that people can walk, which is an amazing thing. She was telling me a little bit about prosthetics, and this was all so new to me. I wanted to be really careful to experience everything when it was happening. So I tried really hard to stay in the moment and be like, okay, Ange, that sounds great, and I look forward to talking to you when we get to that stage.
I think most people would be angry or frustrated, kind of replaying that incident. And he wasn't in either place. He was genuinely present. And he said to me, my energy right now, all of my goal is to focus on today, and I'm looking one day at a time.
And at that point, for some reason, a pair of shoes popped into my head. I remember hitting me kind of deep because I think that was the first time that I was realizing that there were things that I'd never be able to do again. I realized I was like, I'm never gonna be able to put shoes on and walk again on my own.
And then he said, I do have one question. Can I wear any kind of shoes with the prosthesis? And I said, yeah.
And I said, cool. I've got some unfinished business.
I met a man named Melchizedek. He was a good man.
Even though everything that's happened to me has been very personal and changed me physically and emotionally, it's impacted the people around me just as personally as it has myself. I had to see the sadness in everyone's face when they heard about what had happened, and that's something that's going to stick with me forever.
He's not fooling himself into thinking like, oh, life's easy now. Like, he knows it's a journey and there's going to be more obstacles ahead.
Waking up in the morning and knowing that you have people around you that are going to help support your goals and help you get through the hard times and help you celebrate the good times is motivation in itself to want to succeed.
I'm just one small piece in his big puzzle of his life.
I have no doubt in my mind he's going to conquer the world one step at a time.
This is my life, and I'm alive today for a reason, I think, and I want to live my life to its fullest potential. As long as I'm still here and get to wake up every day, I'm going to create the future that I want, no matter what.
Oh. Oh, it's right here. Okay, are we live?
Testing, testing.
Yes. Craig brought his own chair, so we'll use this one.
Yeah, I do that these days. Yeah, how is everybody? Awesome. How are you? Doing well, thank you. Yeah, firstly, just wanted to thank everybody for being here and sharing a little bit of your morning with us and taking the time to hear a little bit about our stories. And yeah, we're excited to be here.
Let me give that to you.
Awesome. So yeah, the theme of today's keynote is self-systems advocacy, how telling your story makes a difference. And that's what we're up here to do, is to share kind of the power of shared stories and lived experiences and how that can work towards self-advocacy and systems change, but also how it is really an evolution, and it starts in this situation through trauma, in a not great situation. And this video is really great. It's inspirational and exciting, but it doesn't really tell the whole story. When we film this video, it'll be 10 years ago, July 4th, from when the injuries took place. So that's a long time. So you can tell by how much younger I look in the video. And Angela looks the same, but
no.
I look like
No.
I've aged much more than 10 years. But you know, it was a long time ago. And it had also been a while since we had watched this video too. So as we were preparing this week for this presentation, I was watching this video with my wife, who's in the audience today, with my mom and stepfather. And we were watching the video and got through it, and she asked me, so looking back at yourself all this time ago and seeing the work that you've done today, do you feel like you've accomplished your goal? Have you set out to do what you intended to through, you know, talking about your story, sharing it, and working in advocacy? And I had to think really hard back to myself 10 years ago to really try and think where my mindset was. What was I trying to accomplish? And to be honest with you, I didn't even really know what advocacy was. I didn't know what being a self-advocate was, and I really didn't know what systems advocacy was either, and how you make an impact on systems, or what that was. I was just kind of in it, and I always say, and I think a lot of trauma survivors will say as well, we're not self-advocates, we are just surviving. We do everything out of survival, navigating systems that we're in, that are around us, and it's a survival mechanism. And then we learn through retrospection and continuing to tell our stories that they do have an impact on systems change. And that's what we're going to share today, a little bit more detail about the actual trauma and how it's all intertwined. And with me we have Angela, who's a good friend of mine and also my prosthetist. And we're going to kind of, a lot of the stories we tell are going to be the same because it's us navigating it, but it's going to be a different perspective on each side, which I think is really important to see how there can be two people living through the same events from different vantage points, but still having similar revelations and seeing similar barriers. So yeah, without further ado, we'll jump into it. And I'm really bad with timing, so we're going to see if we can do this in time. Yeah. If anyone in the back is keeping time, and just start waving your arms if I need to speed up. Great, so we're gonna start July 4th, 2016, and share a little bit about that and go into more detail, kind of picking up right from where the beginning of the video left us with the 911 call, which was intentionally put at the very beginning, and it's intentionally meant to be a little jarring, because I think that's what trauma is. It happens in an instant, and everything changes, and then you're kind of left to build from whatever's left and figure it out from there. So from there, I had just gotten home from the Boulder Reservoir. At the time, I put on events for a living. We had just put on a 5K fun run on the 4th of July, and I had gotten home to my house that I was sharing with some roommates, only about a mile from this location here in Arapahoe, so right here in Boulder. And I was unloading the back of my car, excited to go to Folsom and see the fireworks, when all I really remember was feeling an impact as I was unloading the back of my car, and I found myself kind of pinned up on my tailgate. And as I was there, I looked down in shock, and I saw that my legs had been crushed. And I didn't know what had happened, or seen what had happened, or even really process what had happened. I just knew that something had happened, and it wasn't good. So from there, thankfully, it was the 4th of July, so there were people out in the afternoon already heading up to Folsom, so neighbors were around. So as the impact happened, I was calling for help, and there were people around that were able to come to my assistance. I remember being helped from kind of the back of my tailgate onto the street, and people were calling an ambulance. And I remember as people were calling an ambulance, I started instructing the neighbors around me who were there to take off their belts, whatever they could, to tie tourniquets around my legs to stop the bleeding. Because again, I wasn't really sure what had happened. I just knew it wasn't good, and that I knew enough that the amount of blood loss that there was not a good thing, and we had to stop that. And it ended up being a belt, and I think someone's shoelace that had been used as a tourniquet. And all I remember saying is, pull them as tight as you can. I'm gonna scream, but just keep pulling them tighter. And later I would learn that from a surgeon that those tourniquets stayed on my legs until I entered surgery hours later, and were really the only reason that I was able to survive. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse that I was conscious through the whole thing. So finally the ambulance came. I was loaded in and taken to Boulder Community Health, which is the one right down the street from here on Arapahoe, and where I'm sure a lot of people here work or are familiar with. And at the time, this was a long time ago, before BCH was a Trauma 2 center, so they took one look at me and knew that my injuries were kind of outside of the realm of what could be treated here at BCH. So then I was airlifted Flight for Life to Denver Health for their Trauma 2 unit. And I was what was called a limb or life case, meaning that the only way to save my life was to do a full amputation of my legs, which I didn't really know what that term meant at the time, but I was conscious, and looking back, I had always wanted to ride in a helicopter before. I just didn't think that that would be the first time that I did that, and it definitely wasn't as enjoyable as I thought, so not interested in doing that again. So I end up at Denver Health, and I was still conscious this time, and this was the first time I met my first surgeon, who is now a good friend of mine. His name is Dr. Philip Stahill, also known as Dr. Phil, and he's still working. He's up in a hospital in Wyoming now, and unfortunately couldn't make it, but I always want to give him a shout out because he does good work. And the first thing I remember was meeting him coming in to my first surgeries from the helicopter. And I remember him saying that you're going into surgery and we're going to have to do a full amputation of both of your legs. And then I looked at him and I said, all right, you do what you need to do. And then that's when I went under and I woke up in the ICU. And this is a pretty short amount of time for a keynote, so we're not going to have time for all the stories I have to tell, but just know that in between every kind of talking point, there's a bunch of really good stories in between there. So come find me and we can go into more detail on any of that, but we're just going to cruise through so we don't spend too much time. So I spent probably a couple weeks in the ICU, had a lot of really confusing and interesting experiences. When I woke up in the ICU, I saw that on the whiteboard in my room next to patient name, it said John Doe, which was a little confusing to begin with. And I learned that that's because when the paramedics were there, they had cut off my shorts to start dressing the wounds where my wallet was, so they didn't know who I was. So that was a little concerning for a second, but then we ended up getting that figured out. But that kind of shows just the confusion and everything that's happening in those situations when there's not much time. And then from the patient perspective, it really leaves you confused and not really knowing what's going on. And there's there's a system around you that knows what they're doing. They're all trained, but there's no time to inform the patient adequately with everything that's going on. And to be honest, at the time, I wouldn't have really understood what was going on, but that's kind of something with systems that we're in, is you get really used to them just kind of working on autopilot with the patient being a part of that autopilot, but then there's information missing that is helpful for the understanding and to help that confusion and kind of connecting the dots. And then I ended up at Boulder Community Hospital rehab, inpatient rehab, up on Balsam. And sadly, it's not there anymore. And it was a really cool place. And I spent a good month there doing inpatient rehab. And again, everyone was amazing. And I see some familiar faces in here that I first met at BCH. So that's really cool that I had to see familiar faces. And it was really, really regimented. You kind of show up and everybody knows what they're doing and what their job is. And you're, again, just kind of part of that system. And you don't know what questions to ask, and you don't need to, because everything's kind of done for you, and it's really regimented. So my days were kind of waking up and having someone come into my room and do wound care, being told when it was time for OT, going outside and doing PT, being woken up at 3 in the morning with a nurse coming in who just had to jab me with a couple of shots and poke me and change my IV and then leave and go to bed. And it was really kind of autopilot where, as a patient, I didn't need to know what to do or understand what was happening because it was being done, and I assumed for a good reason, but I didn't really, the patient is kind of just a part of that process, but not as well informed as we could be, and that's for a lot of reasons. There's not time, there's not understanding, but you kind of end up in autopilot as well, where you know other people are there taking care of you. And that's when you really learn the importance of what self-advocacy is, because I'll jump forward a little bit to when you return home, is I was in the hospital and ICUs for over a month in total, and I think it was the day before I was discharged that I think in passing I was talking to a nurse and they flipped through my chart And I remember them saying, oh, it looks like you're going home tomorrow. And I was like, really? That's interesting. That's news to me. And that was the amount of prep that I had to get mentally prepared. And I know there was stuff going on in the background with my amazing case manager and doing accessibility things at the house I was going back to and everything, but it was still, it seemed very quick. And I was like, you don't know what it's going to be like when you do go home, but it's happening and it's happening quick, and you're out the door, and then you're there. And this picture here is when I was welcome home, and it's kind of like, all right, but what do we do now? And that's kind of what the rest of this story is about. So then when you get back home and you're in independent living, and again, I didn't call it independent living at the time. I didn't know that that was a thing. I thought I knew how to do it, but it's different after experiencing trauma and having an acquired disability and becoming a wheelchair user and doing wound care. So it's all different in that structure of the hospital. It was there in pieces where I would still have wound care come to my house. I would still have PT and OT, but that was just for a very limited amount of time and based on whatever my insurance provided. And then it kind of stops, and then you're left there trying to figure out what life is again and how you navigate it. And that's where learning to be an advocate is more about survival, because you are in survival mode, trying to figure out what comes next in your life. And we really, as I was sitting there were a lot of questions that kept coming up, and when you're at home and no longer in a hospital setting, you can't push that little button and get someone to talk to. You feel uncomfortable about texting the nurse you're working with because you don't know if they're on duty. You don't have that same access to communicate with knowledgeable people about what was going on. So I was left with a lot of questions. A big question I had was, how do I get fitted for a custom wheelchair? When I was in the hospital, we did the measurements, and my physical therapist sent in the measurements to insurance, so I was there but didn't really understand what was going on, only to learn that that insurance claim would be denied, so that never went through. So I went home in a transport chair, a drive wheelchair that wasn't custom, so then I was left trying to figure that out, and I didn't know how to do that, who to call or what process to do that, along with a lot of other things that we had questions about, like, how do you get hand controls in a car? How do you do that? What's that process? Is it expensive? I don't even know. And other things, how do I navigate my job? Things have changed. I can't do the same job that I did before. How do I talk to my employer about that? How do I know what my rights are? I didn't know what a reasonable accommodation request was. I didn't know if my rights were being infringed upon because I wasn't getting accessible hotels when we traveled, and I didn't know how to ask for it because honestly it was the only world I knew, so I was holding on to it and didn't want to ruffle the feathers and become an inconvenience because I wasn't the same person I was. So I was left with a lot of questions and not really sure where to get the answers.
You're good.
Okay.
I'll be fast.
So I'm way off script, by the way. This might as well be off right now. But anyway, but the one thing that was somewhat consistent in my life was working on prosthetics and working with Angela. And this was before I think we called each other friends. We were kind of in that weird limbo area to where I was like, I think we're friends, but I'm not sure if she just texts me back because she's my prosthetist, and kind of trying to navigate that and being nervous, be like, is it weird to like text when we don't have an appointment? But this was something that started to be consistent that I look forward to, was working on prosthetics. And as we talked about in the first video, it's a pretty intimate relationship where you are exposing your wounds and your legs and your body. And so we ended up forming a really, really strong relationship and friendship that's still strong to this day. And that was really, a big part of my healing process, was having that consistency of going to see Angela and have a human experience where I worked on my rehab and walking, and we got to talk. And as you can probably tell by me not being in prosthetics right now, my journey with prosthetics has a lot of ups and downs and a lot of challenges. And it's not necessarily like how you see it in the movies where someone puts on prosthetics the day after the injuries and then they're in the Paralympics. It's a lot different than that, which I learned the hard way and still am with my 10-year journey. But it was a lot of ups and downs. Because of the nature of my injuries, I had a lot of trauma, and I had skin grafts on the bottoms of both of my legs, which is right where you weight bear through prosthetics, which makes it harder to wear prosthetics, which we learned the hard way. So I think a really good way to describe our journey with prosthetics. And what do you think? I think
Traumatic.
yeah, traumatic would be a good way. Without sensation in my legs, I didn't know when my skin grafts were tearing, so we would have to periodically take my sockets off to see, and a lot of times we would take them off to see liners filled with blood, and then we'd have to wait 2 weeks until the skin grafts healed doing wound care, and then try again. And that's why it's been a long up and down process. But throughout that process, we had a lot of time to get to know each other and talk and use appointments to talk. And because Angela was the one person that I had consistent meetings with, I asked her a lot of questions. And it turns out that we both didn't have the answers, and we both continued to be surprised that, oh wow, that seems like it should be a question that we should have the answer to. Something like getting fitted for a wheelchair, seems like somebody should have thought about that in just the whole, world of things, that's pretty important. And I don't think it was an oversight, but I think there are gaps in the systems and capacity of what systems have bandwidth for, where there are gaps and people are left to fill them ourselves. So then we have a few more pictures just to kind of show the evolution of the prosthetic experience. And this is Angela, and you can tell how long ago the pictures are with the length of Angela's hair. So
and the
as
size
we
of
get,
my belly.
Yeah, as we get closer to recent day, the hair gets longer.
That last picture was 2 days before I gave birth to my son.
Yeah, 2 days before giving birth, we had an appointment where she was making adjustments to my socket. So a testament to just the amazing work that she does. So yeah, a few more. Yeah, and then the healing happening on especially my right leg was taking a long time, like longer than usual with continued wound care. And it turns out that there was a reason for that. On my right leg, I ended up having an infection inside my wound in my right leg that would lead to the need for a required revision surgery on my leg years after. And I don't think I mentioned before, but my right leg is what's called a knee disarticulate amputation. And what that means is my right femur is fully intact, which is really good if you are a candidate for prosthetics. And then they take your kneecap and move it to the end of your femur, and then they shoot a screw in there to attach your kneecap to the end of your femur, and then they connect all of your ligaments to your kneecap, which is pretty cool because I can flex my hamstring, spring, and quads and all that, so it's pretty wild without a knee. But what that means is you have hardware in your leg, and it turns out that's where the infection was, on that hardware, so they had to go in, and I always pictured them as like a drill just kind of reversing a screw. They told me it's not like that, but I still think it is. And then, so yeah, this was an x-ray of the screw, and to be honest with you, I had no idea that that was even in there when I saw this x-ray. It was a little jarring with how large it was. So my immediate question was, can I keep that after you take it out? And they kind of looked at me and like, well, that's a weird question, but I guess. So to this day, you can ask my wife, we still have this screw, and it's magneted to our fridge in our kitchen right now to this day. But yeah, and then I have a really quick story, and we'll have to pass it on to Ange quick here, but this is a really good story that's an example of needing self-advocacy and systems impacting your journey, and this had to do with getting prepped for my revision surgery. It was originally scheduled to be an outpatient surgery at the surgery center, which is much better. You go in the morning, you're out in the afternoon, and you don't have to stay in a hospital and do that setting. And 2 days before the surgery, I get a call from somebody at the surgery center, I think, and they said, unfortunately, you no longer qualify this surgery. You have to reschedule, and you have to check into the hospital, and you have to stay at least one night in the hospital, and do that surgery because the lift at the surgery center isn't strong enough to help you transfer. And since you can't transfer on your own, you have to do this. So a lot of red flags went up in my head because one, I knew that was going to cost a lot more money because you have to stay a night in a hospital. And two, it didn't make sense because I transfer all the time and am able to do that. So there are a lot of things happening in my head. And because I had been, out of the hospital for a while and navigating this, I had learned throughout the course of my journey that it was really important to ask questions. Not only important to ask questions, but it's my duty to ask questions, and I have to be involved in my care. And if something doesn't sound right, I have to speak up. So what ended up happening was, at this time, there wasn't a wheelchair scale available at the hospital. So they only had my pre-amputation weight in my chart. But they were using my post-amputation height when they submitted me for surgery. So to be accepted for surgery, they use a BMI calculation, which uses your height and your weight to see what your body mass index is. So I had the weight listed of a 6'4" person at the height of 4'9". So my BMI was way off the chart, and that led me to be denied the surgery. And if I didn't know that I had the right to be a self-advocate and ask these questions, that would have been me who paid the extra money and went through the extra trauma of more stays at a hospital. So that's a really good story of how being a self-advocate is also involved in systems. And I want to give Sadie a big shout out now because BCH now has a wheelchair scale, which is really amazing. And we can show how telling our stories leads to really amazing systems change.
And I think it's the only one in the Front Range.
Exactly, and since I've just been taking up a lot of time, I'm gonna kind of cruise through the slides. So what ended up happening is Ange and I and my mom and I, every time we would solve a problem, we got really excited and we're like, wow, we should tell other people because it took us so long to figure this out. Whoever the next person down the road is, we wanna tell them so that they can not go through the same work that we did. So we did that, and this was, way before ChatGPT, in a time when Google search wasn't the same as it is now. So it's really hard to find verifiable stuff, especially stuff you could trust about care. So we tried to do it on our own. So we created a platform called Amputee Concierge, which was really, as it says there, meant to save time finding the answers you need. And it was meant to be kind of a victims advocacy platform. We could just submit questions and we would crowdsource answers from community members and get the resources back to you. And again, this is before I knew about any of the other amazing resources that were out there. And the best resource in the world is only as good as if you know about it. And a really good example of that is where I work now. The Center for People with Disabilities is less than 1 mile from BCH. And it took me over 5 years to learn about what a Center for Independent Living is. So there is really showing where the gaps exist in the transitions and things that we have been continuously working on through sharing our stories and experiences and advocacy journeys. So we created this website. We created another one that would help crowdsource accessible locations because every time we'd want to go somewhere in town that we used to enjoy, there would be some sort of accessibility barrier where it would be labeled as accessible, but then it wouldn't be. So we tried to crowdsource wheelchair accessible places through a website called Accessible Boulder. And again, just really trying to do it ourselves. And it turned out we were really reinventing the wheel a lot of times and doing a lot of extra work, but it was a really good learning process. And I have a website where I really started to see the value of sharing our stories and experiences and really seeing that there were other people that understood and had same stories and would really resonate with them even if they had different experiences. And that led me to where I work now at the Center for People with Disabilities. And after Angela has an opportunity to share a little bit, we're going to go through real quickly about some of the tangible examples of how we are changing systems through the work that we do. And with that, here you go, Andrew. I took way too much time, so we'll just go right to, this is just a glimpse of what Angela's going to talk about anyway. Oh, that was an important one. So I just wanted to show off a little bit. I got married May 31st, it'll almost be a year, and after a lot of work with Angela and my family, I stood for the ceremony and for the pictures, and got to share our first dance standing. So wanted to give that a shout out, and that's a testament to Angela's work as well, to stick with me for almost 10 years and stay on that. Yeah.
Craig has a way of keeping people in his orbit, and he at one point said, I thought if I just became friends with all my doctors and therapists, then I could just keep them of the resources with me. So it works. Okay, so turns out I don't love public speaking, so it's awesome that he took as much time as he did. Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna go fast. Craig has changed my life, in short. I met him, like he said, on the 4th floor, Mapleton, rest in peace, the rehab unit. That rehab unit was amazing. I would get called in for people that had a trauma, usually if they needed a device, but sometimes it was just purely education. A lot of times it's family members asking to understand what the next steps are for something. And like I said in the video, Craig was really different than anyone I had ever met. Most people are looking back at their accident and they're angry, looking at their previous life, or they're looking forward and like, I'm gonna be a Paralympian and I'm gonna do, and he was neither of those places. He just was exceptionally present and essentially said to me, thank you for coming. I'm not there yet. I'll reach out when I'm ready to talk more about prosthetics.
Yeah. And for the record, this was still when I had wound vacs on when I first met Ange, so in bearing on prosthetics seemed pretty far away at the time.
Right. So he got discharged home, and like he said, I found myself invested in his journey and trying to understand why there weren't answers to some of these things, and thought, well, I can find out. We can figure this out. And because his prosthetic journey was so delayed because of his wound care, I didn't really have anything to do with him, but I was already like roped in to what he was trying to accomplish. So I was thinking, okay, well, you got to get back to exercise. We're going to work on hand cycling or wheelchair fitting or whatever that is. And my eyes were opened to the many barriers that exist in our, ableist world, I guess. So Craig, before I knew it, I was on his journey of self-advocacy, and I was able to see, a lot of need for change in the world. So I started attending community events with him. I started making trips to the Capitol, just educating myself on different organizations that existed. And he took me to the very first ever Disability Rights Advocacy Day at the Capitol, where I met tons of people with lived experiences as well as organizations that existed. And at this point, I had been in my career for about 15 years, and I didn't know any of this. And I was appalled that I felt like I was pretty aware of all things related to prosthetics and orthotics, I'll say. But I didn't really know anything about living with them or the barriers that existed to being able to return to activity. So through this journey, Craig showed me how not only was it possible to make meaningful change in the world, but he encouraged me to do so. So I just started to get more involved. And I learned that day and the days leading after that Colorado is actually a really great state. We're #1 in the country for people living with disability. But even at that, we have tons of organizations, but they don't all necessarily work together. And I came to realize that we might be fighting for access to airports or to work environments or to the outdoors, but at the end of the day, we're all kind of fighting the same fight. And I realized that there was no professional organization for orthotists and prosthetists that were represented at that DRAD conference. So Craig encouraged me to do something about that. And I ended up creating a coalition in Colorado called the Rocky Mountain Orthotic and Prosthetic Coalition that basically gave people in my industry a common voice to create change and identify where things needed to be improved. So again, there were all these organizations, but everybody was siloed. So in the building this coalition, I was appreciating the idea of community and people working together. And like he said, the organization that he works for today is less than a mile from the hospital, and these two organizations didn't work together at all. So Craig had given me this new lens to view problems through and identify what needed to be changed. So in organizing the coalition, I ended up focusing on the things that I wanted to change most. And one of those was the fact that a lot of my patients had a really hard time returning to activity. And I had spent 15 years at that point trying to explain to people that they didn't have insurance coverage for that. So it was hard to recognize that one of the biggest barriers to their returning to a fully active life wasn't their injuries, it was their coverage. So I ended up with a handful of people creating this movement in the country called So Everybody Can Move. Ultimately, again, I am a prosthetist and orthotist. I am not a policy person, or I work with my hands, I work with patients, but before I knew it, I had formed this coalition, and with Craig's help, we had created a new law in Colorado. So we, in 2023, we passed a law that was called So Everybody Can Move, and the idea was to mandate insurance coverage for secondary prostheses for activity. So, yeah. So none of this would have been possible without, obviously, Craig's original injury, and then kind of dragging me along his journey of self-advocacy, and then realizing that change needed to happen. So we passed this law. I've gotten involved on the national level, and now we're working on to try to pass, our goal is to pass 28 states, the same law in 28 states by the year 2028, when the Paralympics will be on US soil in LA. And that'll be this tipping point for a federal bill, where this can soon hopefully be law of the land, where people should have access to multiple devices to be able to return to skiing, biking, running, whatever it is that brings them joy and helps them live a fully active life. That ends up, the BCH created the Trauma Survivors Network chapter here, and I was lucky enough to get invited to be on that. When I started with this, I told Sadie and the crew that they have to meet this guy named Craig, who was actually at their hospital for a period of time, a long time ago, and making that connection was really powerful. So I introduced him. He is now part of the advisory board for the Trauma Survivors Network, and I'll let you end it with this. I love this community, I love this hospital, and it brings me so much joy, the fact that we can finally start bringing some of these community organizations together to help our community members live the fullest lives.
Yeah, and just real quick, I know that I'm in between everybody here and lunch, but I did want to close out by highlighting a really cool new program that we are piloting between my organization, CPWD, and Boulder Community Health, that actually helped get off the ground through conversation and sharing stories and lived experience at the Trauma Survivor Network meetings. And we realized that there were a lot of shared stories with people seeing that there was a gap between inpatient and outpatient care in that transition, and that we wanted to figure out a way to work together to bridge that gap. So again, with Sadie, who was our BCH champion to help get this grant, we applied for a grant through the BCH Foundation and was just awarded it this year to start a new program that is called the STEP program. And that stands for Support Toward Empowered Post-Trauma Independent Living. Again, shout out to Sadie for that acronym and the name. The ones I came up with were much different and not as good. But yeah, so the problem that we were solving for is many people leave the hospital after traumatic injury without a clear pathway to services that support independent living. And without that connection to navigating benefits, securing housing, and managing daily life, it can be overwhelming. So we wanted to help bridge that gap by introducing independent living skills, training and services to people inpatient, pre-discharge, and that's what the pilot is based on, and we're getting that rolled out now and excited to share more about it. So this is a new pilot and we're working out all the details. So this is definitely something to keep an eye on, and we'll provide more updates. But really what we're solving for here is just the number of trauma patients that go through BCH and the number of people being discharged home, and how many people have an opportunity to get these new resources. And that's what we're trying to fill with the work that we're doing in this pilot program. And right now it's a smaller program specifically for trauma patients. So it works for trauma patients recovering from injuries, individuals who have recently acquired disabilities, older adults, and to help people transition to safely age in place and not having to go to institutional settings. And then also helping people navigate benefits, which is a really big one, and a barrier to independent living for a lot of people. So we're really excited about this program. To really sum up this whole presentation from Self to Systems Advocacy is a program like this transition program, and then passing a law and creating a national coalition. They're all events that are happening right now, but they're really events that have taken, a decade and more to come to a reality. And it's taken a community and sharing experiences to build this out and turn it into something tangible. So the takeaway from today is to really see the power in sharing our stories and our experiences. And you never know who that will resonate with and inspire other people to act on that and to reveal the change that needs to be made so we can work together to create tangible change. And we have more slides. We can talk more about this later. Yeah. You can come find me and we'll talk more about it. And it's a really cool program, but yeah, we really appreciate everybody's time, and thank you for having us here today.